I've disabled that center gizmo. So I know we're moving through things slowly here. I just want to make sure that the guys who haven't used Max before have enough information in a format that's easy for them to swallow, and we will be getting onto the advanced stuff later, but this first lesson I just need to go through and make sure everything's set up correctly for people, so I'm not getting those same mundane questions about am I working in the correct method. So now that we're starting to get a bit familiar with how to work with the object, how to work with different screen modes, the next thing you need to understand is some more advanced shortcuts such as looping and ring selecting your geometry. So I was saying earlier you can swap between vertices, edges, borders, polygon, and the element itself, but within those you can create sub-selections such as ring selections and edge loop selections. So what I mean by that is I'll go here, I'm going to swap to view mode, and if I just drag out some polygons, in Max you've got a couple of nice shortcuts that will just very quickly make you select a loop. So if you double select an edge, you'll select the whole loop along that edge. And if you select an edge and then shift select the adjacent edge to it, you'll select the ring along there. And then you start having the ability to use these tools that we're seeing on the right here. So you've got all sorts of different tools. You know, I'll use things like connect, and you can use things like bridge, so you can bridge between two polygons. So all these tools here, I'll start to explain those. But basically that's the next lot of things you'll need to get used to doing. I used to have hotkeys set up where I'd use Control R to select a loop and Control W, but since then 3ds Max has automatically implemented these shortcuts which let you do it much faster. So those are the methods I use. So what you'll start to notice is that all these hotkeys I use are kind of centered around that left hand area, and I'm not using so many hotkeys that I need to move my hand around too many places. It's all pretty centered around that S key. So I constantly have my middle finger on S, and that's what I use to click it, and everything else is just using around it. Okay, so on top of being able to move things in screen mode and view mode, the next hotkeys you need to get used to are W, E, and R. And those are your move, rotate, and scale shortcuts. So these are these buttons up here. And once again, just like I've seen people use this toolbar for swapping between vertices, edges, borders, and polygons, I see people use these hotkeys in the viewport to change those options. So instead of using these buttons up here, just use W, E, and R. I know it seems obvious, but I've got to say it. So when I select an edge, W will let it move, E will let me rotate it, and you can lock onto those axes just like I was saying before, and R will scale it. So those are the very basics of how to work with an object and how to make sure you're set up in the fastest way possible, using the least amount of shortcuts to do the majority of your work. So now that you've got an idea of how to do those things, the next thing you need to understand is the edge extrusion modeling technique as a whole. So when you're dragging out edges and things like that, you don't want to drag out those edges unless you can see what the end result looks like. So what we're seeing here is an unsubdivided model. So the whole idea behind edge extrusion modeling is that you're seeing the final result while you're modeling. And to do that, you need to subdivide your model. So you've got a couple of different options here, and once again, I know this will seem obvious for a lot of you, but I've seen co-workers do it at different places, and it always kind of bewilders me why, but I've just got to mention it. So you've got a couple of different methods for subdividing your mesh. So one of those is using NURM subdivision, which is a very old version inside Max of subdividing your object. So you can see with NURMs enabled, now that when I drag and move this object, we're seeing a subdivided version of it. But unfortunately, this isn't exactly the NURMS is a lot slower, and when you're dealing with an object that's very high res, you want to use a modifier in your stack. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into the full object mode. So I'm just going to, when you're in vertice mode and stuff, you're only visible with these tools. So I'm just going to unselect use NURM subdivision. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the modifier stack window here, and I'm going to apply a turbo smooth modifier. You can assign a shortcut to this. Sometimes what I like doing is I'll go into customize user interface and go to turbo smooth. And because I don't have F assigned to anything, that's just the front view. When I do that, when I hit F, it automatically assigns that turbo smooth modifier. And you'll see by default, the iterations is just showing you how many times it's subdividing each polygon twice as high res as it was before. So what it's doing is, the way turbo smooth works is it's averaging out between 3 points in 3D space. So you can see here what it's doing is it's the exact same as if you had a 2D graph from the side. So let me just reset my views here. And you can see I've got this mesh from side on, and it's just averaging out between those two points. Now what you're seeing is there it's averaging out between 2 points on just one axis, but it will also do it on all 3 axes. So if I double select that loop and drag out, now it's averaging out between 3 points. And this is where the power of edge extrusion modeling comes from. The ability to drag out in real time and see what type of effect you're having on your object. So earlier on I was saying I had show and result mapped. What show and result is going to do is it's going to let you use turbo smooth while you're modeling. So while I'm dragging that out, I can see the total effect it's having on the object as I go. What's quite annoying is though, by default when you have the turbo smooth modifier applied, is that you don't have this isoline display box ticked. So what I want to do is I want to see my raw object just with smooth on it. So now when I drag out, I can see the effect that the smooth object has without all those extra subdivisions kind of cluttering my view. So you're not just limited to dragging out from one point or one loop. You can shift drag out from any number of points. So if I go to border selection mode now and I use the scale tool, I can hold shift and I can drag out all 4 of those points at once. So very quickly you can kind of control things like circular insets and pretty much any point. So any edges you select, they don't need to be next to each other. I can control select the next edge and drag up, and you can see it doesn't matter. So you don't need to just drag from that one point. Let's move on and take a look at some of the tools used in each sub-object selection mode. So let's take a closer look at some of the tools that you're going to be using while doing hard surface modeling. I've tried to limit this to the bare minimum. Occasionally you'll use a different tool set, but for 99% of the stuff we'll be doing, these are the tools we'll be using. So you'll notice first off that when you swap between each sub-object mode, the toolbar changes here. And that's because you've got different options available for each sub-object mode. So in vertice mode, the first tool I'll show you is the shaper tool. And remember, some of these toolboxes have a separate options box next to them. So by default, if you click the button, what it will do is it will bring up the quick version of that tool, and you can just drag in the viewport here and do it that way. Or if you want more control, you can click on the options box next to it and use the little tabs menu here to change that. If you ever want to reset to 0, all you need to do is right click on the option box. Thanks, Connor. And that will reset those settings for you. Okay, next in vertice sub-object mode, you've got the cut tool. So I'm just going to create a little bit of extra geometry first. So I'm going to swap to 2 and go back into edge mode, and we're just going to drag out some edges. And what you'll notice is I've accidentally got edge constraint mode selected down here, which we set to C. So I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to drag out some edges just so I've got a little bit of information to show you what the cut tool's doing. So now we've got a bit of geometry there, and if I swap back to 1 and then go T, now I've got the ability to cut while I'm seeing what's happening on the mesh. All the while I've got my hand over the show and result shortcut button, so that while I'm modeling I can get an idea of what's actually happening, and I'm making sure that I'm not selecting the wrong part of the mesh. So as I'm cutting closer to the mesh, you'll notice it's creating a harder edge there. And this is while I'm creating certain organic shapes and things like that, where that's extremely useful to have that cut tool. Now you can cut through other bits of geometry. You don't have to do it cleanly. So you can see you can cut wherever you want. And as long as I use that same setup where I'm hitting C to rotate, show and result, and then back to T, I can cut and I can make more edge loops. And what that's going to do is it's just going to create a harder edge in places where there's more loops. Okay, lastly, I can weld two vertices in vertice sub-object mode. So if I click this button here, you'll notice it hasn't done anything. And that's because in the options box, the weld threshold hasn't been high enough to work. So now that I've set the weld threshold to be greater than the distance between those 2 points, it's welding them together. I can click plus and then select the next loop, and you'll see it's just welded them together. Now what you'll notice is, now that I've gone above that, what 3ds Max does is it saves the settings from the last time you used a tool. So now when I select these two vertices, it's going to use the same settings of 6.2 centimeters to weld them. And if I just click the button, it's much faster. So those are the 3 main tools I use in vertice sub-object mode. In edge sub-object mode, I either like to use extrude, and what that'll do is if I click that, it's just going to give you the option to extrude out in a similar way to how I'm doing with shift and drag. But the difference here is when I use the actual tool itself, is it can extrude out along the normal of that edge. So you'll notice when I'm doing it this way, it's extruding out along the normal of this edge. Whereas if I just go and shift drag out, I can't do that. So that's where it can be beneficial to use that. The next tool in edge sub-object mode is the chamfer tool. Now you'll remember in vertice mode, it's the same tool, but this is having an effect on the edge itself. So if I select that loop there and use the chamfer tool, I can just split that along the edges. But I never really like to do that manually. I always have this as an option box, because this option box gives you that little bit more information to add more detail to your mesh. So what I mean by that is you've got option boxes here to have an open chamfer. If you tick that, it's just going to split them and create the open edge. Or you can add individual edges in between, which is going to give you a nice rounded edge if you're doing bevels or things like that. So you don't have to add those support loops. You can always just go smaller, and you can see how if I go smaller, it's having a similar effect as if I go bigger and add more loops. Okay, the next thing you can do in edge mode is you can bridge two loops themselves. So if I drag these out here and get rid of this inside loop, now I can select these two adjacent edges and use the bridge tool, and it's going to just combine those again. So just like chamfer, you can use the options box, and you've got a bunch of different settings to use here. Okay, so another tool I use in edge mode is the edge constraint toggle. So what does this tool do? It's probably one of the most important tools in the asset. It's one of the most important assets you have while you're modeling. What this tool does is, if I just drag out some edges here, right, is it will snap your selection to the edge which you're basing it on. So if I click C, which is the shortcut for that, now I can't move anywhere but along the angle at which that polygon resides on. So it's snapping it to that. Even if I use the x-axis mode with it off, you can see it's dragging out, but as soon as I turn that on and use that, it's sliding it down those edges. So it's an extremely important tool. I'm just running you through the tools I use at the moment, but once we start creating some shapes, I'll explain the power of that and how that helps keep your meshes clean. In edge mode, you can still use cut. It's identical to using vertice mode. So if I swap to vertice mode, you can see I can do the exact same thing. And lastly, we've got the polygon sub-object tools used. So firstly, you can use the extrude tool. Once again, that's got an option box as well. And you can extrude by the normal. So what I'll do is just to demonstrate that, if I drag out and select all these polygons, now when I extrude, if I go by normal, it's going to push them out along the axis in which this normal of this face is coming out at. So lastly is the inset tool, and all this will do is just pushing the polygon inside the selection you have. So if I select a bunch of them, you can see here how it's just pushing them in. You can do it via polygon itself, which I don't use often. But this is for times when you want to add like a little circular inset to the object, and I'll show you that next. So these are all the basic 3ds Max tools I use. Now there's one last tool that I use, which is an extension of the 3ds Max tools, and it was written because of my Hard Surface Essentials tutorial, where I was using a really complex method to generate circular insets in the polygons. So it's called Loop Regularizer, and basically if you go to scriptspot.com, I'll provide a link for this as part of the download for this lesson. What you do is you just go here and download this script. So once it's downloaded, locate where it downloaded to, and all you need to do is you just need to drag it into the 3ds Max viewport, and that will automatically install it for you. So once you've done that, you'll see now that I've got the ability to, what this tool does is it creates a perfect circular face out of the selection you have. And it doesn't matter how many polygons you have selected, it will still make a completely clean version of that. So let me just add a little bit of information to this object. So now if I select all these points, which are completely random, and I use that inset tool, which is what we were using last, now if I right click, I can click regularize, and it's going to create a perfect circular inset of that, which is extremely useful, you'll see later on, for when we want to create holes for bolts and things like that. So those are all the tools I use, and I know it's a little bit boring running through them, but I've got to do it, and later on when I'm using these tools on more production assets and things like that, I'm going to explain to you their importance at different points in time of the mesh creation process. So that wraps up the first lesson. I know it's very basic, but I do have to target the course for guys who haven't used Max before. I really appreciate your support in buying this course. It's made a massive difference to my personal life. I need you guys to understand that a lot of the money I make from the course, I'm investing back into it, and I've got a new website along the way that's going to make things a lot easier for subscribers. On top of that, it's funding all of my personal boxing goals. So I've got my first fight lined up next month, which I'll post online, and I think it's good to know that I'm not doing this just to make a quick buck and then, disappear. Like, this is a long-term goal for me. I really want this course to build up to the point where you are producing models like you're seeing on the screen, because they really do only use the techniques you just saw. So if I just select one object, for example, and zoom in, you can see it's very, very basic. And all those tools I just showed you are all there. So the inset tool I just used, for example, if I delete these points and I mess that up, if I go back and use that regularize tool, I've just created that circular inset again. The same goes for all the vertice sub-object selections. The way I model stays the same the whole way. So in the next lesson, what I'm going to get down to is I'm going to start covering some of the basic design principles behind my work, because you'll notice it's very curvy and everything kind of is trying at least to flow together. So now in the next lesson, we're going to start building up some of the shapes using the workflows and tools that I've explained in this lesson. Once again, I just want to thank everyone for subscribing. I really appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward to making this course a fully complete and fully enclosed modeling course for anybody who's never done it before and wants to do the type of work you see in cinematics and game covers and film.